Hello and welcome to Viewing the Bible in an Agnostic Way by Mr. Duper. Now, what I want to do is I want to go over how people view the Bible and how to, in my opinion, properly view it. I know this is a controversial subject and I'll probably piss off everybody at some point or another with my personal opinion on it. But the only way to do it is in an agnostic way. And I'm going to get to what that is in a moment. But just strap in, hope you listen with an open mind, and hopefully you learn something from it, and hopefully that you have some counterpoints to what I have to say, and we can all just learn from each other. First, let's go over some terms. Agnosticism, which is not certain of a given stance. The Bible, the collection of ancient texts to create the Christian holy book. That's 66 books. We'll get more into it a little bit. There's epistemology, which is a study of what we believe and why we believe it. And this is something that people always seem to neglect. They just take the Bible and say, hey, the Bible's true. Or say, hey, the Bible is a bunch of hogwash. Well, why? They don't know. They don't have an answer. So we have to study why we believe what we believe. There's also Hegelian dialectics to consider. An idea, which is the thesis, automatically forms the pushback, which is the opposite. It negates the thesis, the antithesis. And the battle of these two ideas forms a new idea, the synthesis. So the Hegelian dialectics today is that the Bible is perfect and the Bible is not perfect. And these two ideas are going to battle in this presentation. We're going to figure it out. The law of non-contradiction. Nothing can be what it is and what it is not. And in the terms of the Bible, it cannot be perfect and not perfect simultaneously. Then we have the law of validity. If one part of an argument is false, the whole argument is invalid. Now, I'm not saying like one tiny minute detail of something is false, then the whole argument falls apart. No, the core pillars of an argument, right? The core things that the entire argument is based upon, and if one little thing about that changes, the whole argument changes. That is what I'm talking about. So if with the Bible, if one little thing is found false about the Bible, then the Bible cannot be perfect by definition, right? Because the Bible is supposed to be all true, 100%, completely literal. And same thing with people who say the Bible is not true and it's all hogwash. If one thing in the Bible is found to be true, then it's not all hogwash. Something's there. So let's just explore what's going on here. I don't know if any of you recognize who this man is, but he is St. Thomas Aquinas, born 1225, died 1274. He was a theologian, a philosopher. He was one of the earliest men to use Aristotelian logic to defend the Bible. At this time, Aristotelian logic was considered the highest form of learning, and it's still valued today, but today we seem to value more of a Plato logic, which actually supports the Bible more than the Aristotelian does. Aristotle was a materialist, but can't get into this now. We have to continue. St. Thomas Aquinas found that there was no conflicts between Greek philosophy and Christian teaching. And he felt, and this is one of his more controversial opinions, if our interpretation is proven wrong, then we must alter our interpretation. So if something about how we interpret the Bible is wrong, then we have to change our interpretation. I want to sure you guys know who this is. If not, then you're not Catholic probably. Pope John Paul II. His papacy began in 1978 and he died in 2005. He is regarded as one of the greatest popes in modern times. And on the subject of evolution, he was quoted saying, "This theory has been progressively accepted by researchers following a series of discoveries in various fields of knowledge, the convergence, neither sought nor fabricated, of the results of work that was conducted independently is in itself a significant argument in favor of this theory." That's a mouthful. What does that mean? It basically meant that he felt that evolution was true, that all these different views were coming together, proclaiming one thing, and that there was enough evidence to say, hey, this is true, the previous beliefs that evolution is false is wrong. and that evolution is true. And the reason I bring these two men up is because, yes, they're both Catholic, but these two men, over 1,000-year time difference, came to a similar conclusion, that when presented with new evidence, we have to change our interpretation. These were great minds in the Catholic realm, and great minds in general. So there's that. Now, if you know this guy, you're probably Protestant. Martin Luther, founder of the Protestant Reformation. He had his 5 solas: sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, sola Christus, sola Dei gloria. Only Scripture, only faith, only grace, only Christ, only for the glory of God. These 5 pillars is what all modern Protestantism is based on. And with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation set forth a precedence that the Bible is perfect and the total source of truth. This was not found anywhere else in the Christian world. Not found in the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Coptics, the Assyrians, only in the Protestant churches, and that belief still finds itself today in most Protestant churches, that the Bible is the sole source of truth and everything else has to form to what the Bible says, rather than truth being existing outside of the Bible and the Bible being something else. Let's go over a little history of the Bible. There are 66 undisputed canonical books that are agreed upon by every single denomination and faith out there. There are 7 Catholic books and 6 more Eastern Orthodox books. These are the big ones. The Orthodox combines 2 of the books, so for the Orthodox there's a total of 12 extra canonical books, where the Catholics it's 7. St. Jerome put together the canonical Bible in 400 AD, and 19 years later, the Second Council of Carthage added the Catholic books. The Dead Sea Scrolls date roughly to 250 BC to 33 AD. And this is the earliest sources that we have of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and 2,000 years ago. Now everything else like this, the originals, I'm talking like first written down by whoever wrote the Old Testament books, are lost. We only have these transcribed of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Jewish tradition of monotheism dates roughly 4000 BC, and monotheism is nothing new, right? You have the Zoroastrians, you have, Sikhs came later, but monotheism isn't that strange because there was always a local cult that believed that their God was one above all, right? So the monotheism dates way back, right? The Jews were dispersed by Babylon, sent back by the Persians, and subjugated by the Greeks and Romans. So by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, there was like 1,000 years of history. I'm just using a round number. It's not actually 1,000, but there was 1,000 years of history that had happened. And as they were dispersed and sent back and subjugated, there was a whole lot of time that things could have been mistranscribed or misremembered or lost or added, or there's a lot of play within that time period. And with the New Testament, it was written in 70 AD, which was 40 years after Christ. These are all second-hand accounts. So there's a lot of things that may be added or misquoted or not known. And anybody out there who says, oh, 40 years isn't that far off, I'd like to remind you, we don't know who killed Kennedy. Yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald, but how many conspiracies with the Kennedy assassination? So imagine people who heard this 40 years after somebody talking. A lot that can get added and misunderstood. We're going to start at the beginning of the Bible, exploring different things, with Genesis. And Genesis is Jewish mythology. It's clearly Jewish mythology. The Catholic Church even declares that it's mythology. Figures like Bishop Robert Barron even say so, like publicly, because it's just so inaccurate. There's creatures like the Nephilim, which were the offsprings of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The book of Numbers says they were giants. We don't know what they were. We don't know if they were heroes, if they were kings, if they were giants, if they were mutants. We don't know what they were. The meaning of it was lost. We have people we have records of people living hundreds of years. Like the oldest was Methuselah, which was like 900 and some years old. It's impossible. No one lives 1,000 years. We also have stories such as the Tower of Babel, which is a real place. It was found in Iraq. It's 7 levels tall, built by Nebuchadnezzar II. It was the place of learning of cuneiform, and when it was destroyed, people no longer understood each other within the empire, because this is where everybody went to learn cuneiform. This was the standard of learning, and when that standard was broken, people didn't understand each other, and all the local dialects took precedence. So the Tower of Babel was telling the story of this temple that people learned in. There was a world flood. Continuing in Genesis, there was a world flood. It happened around 10,000 BC. The ice caps broke in Canada, which flooded the world's edges. Randall Carlson is a geologist. He talks about this. He found soil that has the same type of fingerprint that in Canada in the Midwest. And this is one of the reasons he believes there's no trees in the Midwest, that a giant ocean literally tore straight through the Midwest and out into the Pacific, and it flooded all of the edges of the world. There's also other stories in Genesis, such as King Nimrod, which parallels nicely with Sargon of Akkad. Other titles include the rightful ruler, which really meant he was a usurper. Sargon of Akkad the Great, the first king of Mesopotamia, and all the known world. This guy had more cities, like more civilization under his control than anyone else pretty much in all of history. This guy came closer to conquering the known world than anyone else, even though it was ultimately one of the smallest empires that ever existed. Stories like the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2:10 through 14, says it was between the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Okay, the first two are extinct rivers, but the second two exist today. And if you follow where we believe the 4 rivers were, and I'll show you some evidence on that in a second, you end up in the Persian Gulf, which is now completely underwater. And evidence, it's hard to say, but it's believed that this would have been a very fertile valley, which would have been very garden-like, with no dangerous fauna, no predators. So these people wouldn't have to worry about too much. You know, you got your snakes, you got a couple of things, but there was no lions, tigers, and bears. David Rohl, he's an Egyptologist. He studies ancient languages, and the Gihon and the Pishon are believed to be in these 2 areas. You see the Tigris, Euphrates, and you see the 2 coming together into the Persian Gulf. I don't know the full logistics of this. Please tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that he was able to look at ancient languages and kind of piece them together to find that these 2 rivers are roughly here. Now, this is a picture from the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies of what the pre-flooded world would have been like. And this is the Ice Age, 10,000 BC. And as we notice, Britain's connected to France. There's a whole bunch more land just everywhere. And if we look at where the Persian Gulf is, it's completely solid. There's a nice fertile valley in there. If you can see, it's right around here. But so when everything flooded, all this land went away. This also leads to the Atlantis theory, which we don't know where it is. Could have been anywhere here, anywhere in here, any of this land that now underwater. But I'll come to that in a second. Our evidence for the Atlantis theory is Göbekli Tepe, which is the largest megalithic site in the world. It was built 7,000 years before Stonehenge. It was believed to be built before agriculture. And the Atlantis theory of the global flood theory is where there was a more advanced civilization. There was a technology transfer. They built this, and this is our evidence of why there was a global flood, because the flood story also says that, well, Atlantis, the story goes by Plato, that it was consumed by the sea. Perfect time, perfect place, perfect possibilities. Now, this evidence is very circumstantial, but it's possible. Graham Hancock's book, The Magicians of the Gods, explains this theory a lot nicer and a lot more detailed than I'm able to go into. I'm just some guy on his computer who likes to read a lot. I encourage everybody watching this to go study themselves. Now we're going to enter some historical discrepancies about the Bible. 1 Kings 6:1 says, "And it came to pass in the 418th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel." All right, what does that mean? It means if we count the date back, we know when Solomon's temple was built. That's a real place. That was a real event. And if we go back 418 years before that was built, we get the Exodus at roughly 1450 BC. Now, I know there's a lot of people who believe that the Exodus isn't real, but I'm going to show you some evidence that it was real, just not in the way that we think. It was most likely done by the Hyksos, which were a Canaanite people enslaved in Egypt. They were expelled by Pharaoh Ahmose in 1530 BC, roughly. This is a long time ago, and these dates get iffy by like 10, 20 years. And this theory is placed very well by Simcha Jacobici in his documentary, The Exodus Decoded. He explains this in depth hugely. I encourage a watch. It's very good, very entertaining. At the very least, you can get a laugh at it if you think you know better. Some evidence why the Hyksos were the Hebrews in the story of the Exodus. Some Semitic writing was found in the Sinai Peninsula, and it was very similar to ancient Hebrew. Also in the turquoise mines, you find writing which is similar to ancient Hebrew, and you have little things written like El save me. El was a Canaanite god, later became Elohim, which means God, essentially, to the Hebrews. And when you go into Midian, which is Arabia and Sinai Peninsula area, the Shasu people worshipped a god named Yahu, and this was found in that area, or same time, same place as the Hyksos, and this is believed to be the earliest record of the Tetragrammaton of Yahweh, which was the Jewish name for God. So Elohim was like what he was, Yahweh was his name. And during this time, the Minoan eruption occurred, which happened somewhere between 1642 to 1540 on the late end. So if we're going by the late end, this would have happened around the same time the Hyksos were enslaved and right before they were about to be expelled. Now, when reading Exodus, we often happen to have this idea of that it happened in a very short period of time, but the opposite is true. It probably happened over 5-10 years because Pharaoh stayed in power for life. So as things got worse and worse and worse, until eventually he says, leave. So it probably happened around this time, and the Minoan eruption can be linked to the cause of most, if not all, the plagues. And this is found in the documentary, The Exodus Decoded. Continuing past the Exodus, we go into the Bronze Age collapse. Now, the next thing that happened after the Exodus was they were in the desert for 40 years, and then they conquered the land of Canaan. Now, the best time this were to happen would have been the Bronze Age collapse. Now, the Bronze Age collapse was roughly 1200 BC. It was 200 years later compared to the 1400 BC, which is when the Bible would have recorded of the conquest of Joshua. Right? During this time, only Egypt survived, and all the other, like the old Babylonian Empire, the Hittites, the Mysia, Assyrians, all these like empires and all these like great kingdoms fell. So in Canaan, it was nothing but a bunch of city-states, because prior to this point, it was all owned by Egypt, and now Egypt was out of the picture. All these small city-states, this would have been the perfect time for a Canaanite people to conquer another Canaanite group of people. And just as the Bible said, full conquest of Canaan never occurred. There was outliers, there was city-states that survived, and the Jewish people, who would become the Jewish people, weren't able to conquer all of it. It matches up nicely, just we got some wrong dates. Some city-states were sacked or resettled, and it was done by another Canaanite people, like I said, who would have been the Israelites, or the people who would later become the Israelites. Now, I know I skipped over a whole ton of books, but just for sake of convenience and time, we have to skip over them, because if I was to go into the Chronicles, the Book of Kings, and just after just all of them, we'd be here all day. So, just jumping right ahead to the New Testament, which was written 40 years after Jesus' death, like I said. Mark is the earliest book written, and the earliest transcripts of the book of Mark end with this. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Talking about Mary Magdalene and Jesus' mother. But obviously someone said something to someone because the story got out, right? So the next other book that was written in a Jewish way was Matthew, and this is the most Jewish of all the books. But then we come to Luke and John. Luke was a doctor. He was studying under Paul, and when he wrote Book of Luke, he used a lot of Greek philosophy at the time, like Greek ideas. And same with John. It's said that Matthew was written to the Jews, Luke to the Greeks, and John the world. But no, Luke and John were Hellenistic in their writing styles, so it's believed that they had Greek influence when writing these stories and lost its Jewishness. And this is important because Jesus was a Jew, and he didn't talk like a Hellenistic Jew. He came from Nazareth, which was a small backwater town that barely had a synagogue. Like, I'm talking like tiny. So he would know nothing of Greek writing styles and speeches, so there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. Now, one thing I'm going to talk about is the historical Jesus. Jesus was a real person. Yeshua de Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. This was a real Jewish person. He spoke. History cannot deny this. We don't have any writings for him because he was an illiterate Jew. He wasn't able to He wasn't able to write, but he probably spoke very well, and he probably knew the Torah very well, the law, and he also knew the rest of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. You have to remember he was a Jew speaking to Jews, and this sounds funny, but this was his mission. He had no ambitions to save the world. It was the Jewish people that he was talking to, and he spoke out against the Jewish establishments. He spoke out against the Sadducees, who were the aristocrats, the priests, and the appeasers to Rome. These were the kind of the atheistic type of Jews. And then you also had the Pharisees, which were the dogmatic rabbis who were spiritually dead but strict observers of the law. And these guys actually, the Pharisees actually led to what is now the modern Jewish religion. The Sadducees, their ideas fell out of favor, but yeah. So Jesus, he disturbed the peace and threatened the establishment, which he did. He spoke out about how the priests were spiritually dead, how observing the law to such a dogmatic way was not what the law was about. How the law was made for man, not man for the law, and he disrupted everything. And doing this, Rome saw him as a threat to Rome. Rome, how they viewed it was that the priestly class in Israel only existed by their good graces, right? So Jesus speaking out against the establishment was in effect speaking out against Rome, because can't forget, the Romans were the ones who killed him, not the Jews. The Pharisees saw him as a threat to the people, and the Sadducees saw him as a threat to their positions, right? He was tried by Pontius Pilate, who was a coward, and gave the option to the people for fear of rebellion. And this is true right now, because Pontius Pilate was not afraid to kill people. He crucified people left and right and made public displays of it. But this was a very sticky situation, that he was afraid that if he killed him, then he would cause a rebellion. And if he didn't kill him, then Jesus would form a rebellion himself. So he didn't know what to do. And at this point, Pontius Pilate fell out of favor with the Roman elites, and he was afraid that he was going to be killed. So This was an un-Roman thing to do. He gave it to the people, and this was a very cowardly thing. And later, Pontius Pilate was actually sent back to Rome, and he committed suicide before he even got back there, because he knew he was going to be the one who was crucified. Now, Jesus was executed as a bandit along 2 other bandits, not thieves. This sounds like an interesting distinction, but bandit was a blanket term for a series of crimes. Somebody who would cause troubles to Rome, like raiding a caravan, or attacking a soldier, or causing like rebellions or revolts, or disturbing the peace, the Roman peace. That was a bandit. It was a blanket term. And the reason why this is an important distinction is because it's a mistranslation, because the thieves were not thieves. Roman law, the thieves had their hands cut off, but only bandits were crucified. It was a more serious crime. And Riza Aslan's book Zealot tells the story quite nicely. Now, I know a lot of people have problems with Riza Aslan, but he's a pretty good historian. You got to give him credit for that, and he has all this information about the historical Jesus, and none of this stuff is controversial. Even if you don't believe the Bible, if you don't believe anything of the Bible was true, all of what I just said is true. The Bible says it's true. Historians say it's true. Atheists, well, educated atheists will say this is true. Nobody disagrees on this, and this is the platform what I'm going to set up later. Now, we're going to explore the theological and philosophical problems with Jesus. Now, in the Bible, sacrifices were done to appease God's wrath from sin, Leviticus 4:35. And in John 10:30, it says, "The Father and I are one." So, this means Jesus sacrificed himself to appease himself. Anybody see a problem there? This is not the reasoning why he did it, but just a natural conclusion. Because if a sacrifice is done to appease God's wrath, and Jesus and the Father are one, that means to appease his own wrath, he sacrificed himself. That's circle theory. That is circle theory in its most blatant form, and this is done with just a little bit of thinking. Death is the payment for sin, and Jesus paid in full. I'm not going to make that stupid argument that Jesus faked his own death, because no, he died, right? But charged with banditry under a Roman tribunal, does this qualify for the sacrifice of sin? And this is a serious question, because sacrifices were always done in a specific place at a specific time by a specific person. And the only thing that Jesus got right was that he was in the Jerusalem area around roughly the same time that the sacrifices would be going on. It wasn't done in the temple. It wasn't done by the priest. It was done by Romans outside of the city. It doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't fit the sacrifice that the Bible lays out. So there's some discrepancies here. What's going on? I don't know. Some more problems. With death being permanent for man, does resurrection nullify the sacrifice? And I'm going to use a money analogy here. Jesus always used, not always, but Jesus used money analogies because they were effective, and I'm going to use one today. Was it a loan? Because a sacrifice is you give your money and you don't get it back. But Jesus, when he was resurrected, was greater than he was. So is that really a sacrifice, or was it a loan? He got more coming back from the dead than when he was alive. And continuing, the Council of Chalcedon declared Jesus had 2 combined natures, God and man. God, man, right? With his death, is it the man nature that died, or both? Can God die? What are the ramifications of that? And I don't subscribe to the duality, the physical and the metaphysical. Jewish thought at this time, even by the Pharisees who believed in the resurrection, was that everything was combined, your soul and your body. So that means that God and man would have had to die. And what are the ramifications of that? And the Bible says he entered Sheol. That's the old Hebrew term, right? Sheol was the resting place. It doesn't exist. It was a term, right? So did he enter Sheol? Our modern idea of hell? What happened here? There's something that's not something ain't right. And the people who wrote the New Testament, I don't think they knew either. I think they were just kind of grasping at straws, and it's kind of apparent. We're going to form a conclusion now on the concept of agnosticism. Theological and historical discrepancies cause question to biblical validity. And there is some question there. Nobody can disagree with this. I've brought up some very good things. Law of non-contradiction. The Bible cannot be perfect and not perfect simultaneously. It is an either-or statement, and that's true. Is it perfect or is it not perfect? And the law of validity, the claim that the Bible is perfect, is nullified with historic accounts that prove inaccuracies. The Bible was wrong by hundreds of years by the dates. They were wrong with different things that happened. But there was some real events that it was talking about, like the flood, like the Tower of Babel, and the Exodus. So there's something there, but it's not accurate. It's not perfect. So conclusion, the Bible is not perfect. And for everybody out there who's really angry at me for saying the Bible is not perfect, calm your stuff. Secondary conclusion coming. The Bible is the single greatest holy book in history. The fact that so many authors over so many years handled it makes it the best book because the bad was filtered out. And compared to other monotheistic religions with one author whose prejudices were added compared to the Bible where it was left out. Now, I'm not saying there's not prejudices or things that are wrong. There's slave ownership, there's killing of the gays, there's bad stuff in the Bible that, especially now, we wouldn't have. But because people were handling it over hundreds and hundreds of years, the bad was filtered out. There's no one out there saying kill all the gays. Well, there is, but for the most part, modern interpretations of the Bible don't say kill the gays, don't say kill anybody who sleeps with an animal, all this other weird stuff that were very important at the time for them. But it is important to look at the Bible as a spiritual guide and help live a good life, not a textbook. There's other books that we can go into, such as the book of Proverbs and the book of Psalms, not to mention different ideas like in the book of Romans, and even the Gospels themselves. They have a lot of good information in it. Things like turning the other cheek, being frugal with your money, learning from the wisdom of the people who came before you, but not believing them dogmatically. These are all found in the Bible. This is a very spiritual book. It's not a textbook. Don't view it as a textbook. Don't view it as the literal words of God. View it as a spiritual book that had changed over time, that flaws happened, and people are inherently imperfect. We will never achieve perfection. We will achieve greatness, but never perfection, because perfection is impossible. So live a good moral life, and do not put your morals on other people, because that is the definition of immoral. I hope you learned something, and I hope you have something to add to this conversation. And I thank you for your time, and have a good day. Mr. Duper, out.